Tonight on the Sleep Scientist _S, we'll follow a signal drifting through the stars, a quiet whisper from somewhere deep in the universe. What begins as a strange pulse captured by a sleepy observatory slowly unfolds into a story of curiosity, courage, and cosmic wonder. Guided by the stars and the stillness of night, you'll journey alongside Leora, a quiet scientist who listens not just with instruments, but with her heart. What does the universe sound like when it calls your name in silence? And what might we find when we dare to answer? So settle in, get cozy, and let this soft, starlit story carry you far beyond Earth, to where the stars remember. The Silent Dome. High in the mountains, where the clouds brush the earth like slow waves of mist, there stood an old observatory, forgotten by the world but alive with secrets. The dome was silver, weathered by time, with a great telescope tucked gently beneath it. No one had used the telescope in many years, until a quiet scientist named Dr. Leora arrived. She was soft-spoken, curious, and tired of the loud, busy world below. She came not to make grand discoveries, but to listen. Each evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon and stars began to bloom like frost on black velvet, Leora would climb the spiral staircase and open the dome. The wind would whisper, and the telescope would creak like it remembered how to breathe. Tonight, she turned the telescope toward a cluster of stars near the constellation Lyra. Not to search, just to watch. But something was different tonight. A rhythmic blinking. Not a star, not a satellite. A soft, pulsing light. One that blinked like a heartbeat, once every 6 seconds. She adjusted the scope, wiped the lens, and checked again. Still there. She noted it in her log. Unidentified light source. Gentle, regular. Possibly pulsar, possibly not. She felt calm. Sleepy, even. She closed the dome halfway, brewed a warm cup of chamomile tea, and curled up on the chair beneath the telescope. Outside, the light blinked on. And off. On. And off. Like it was waiting for her to reply. Tea leaves and telemetry. Dr. Leora sat by the window, her tea steaming gently beside her, and the soft wooden walls of the observatory humming with the wind outside. The fire crackled quietly. Her logbook lay open, the pages fluttering as if the observatory itself were urging her to write more. She glanced again at the note she'd written. Unidentified light source. Gentle, regular. Possibly pulsar, possibly not. The phrase echoed in her mind like a question whispered by the stars. She stood slowly, walked over to the old cabinet beside her telescope, and pulled out a stack of forgotten telemetry papers, hand-drawn graphs from decades ago. Some still smelled faintly of dust and lavender, left behind by the astronomer who once lived here. She remembered reading about him, Professor Linnell, a man who claimed the sky could speak if you listened closely enough. Perhaps Leora was starting to believe that too. She carefully calibrated the telescope to center on the blinking light again. There it was. Still blinking. Still steady. Still, waiting. With a calm determination, she connected an old radio frequency receiver to the telescope's auxiliary line. The observatory wasn't exactly modern, it was built for silent stargazing, not communication, but with a few gentle clicks and wires, she created a makeshift signal monitor. The receiver began to pick up something unusual. Not noise. Not static. But pattern. Soft, steady beeps, short, long, short. Like Morse code, but different. Slower. Measured, almost sleepy in rhythm. She jotted it down. Again. And again. The tea had gone cold, but her heart was warm. Not from fear, but from wonder. Someone, or something, was trying to say hello. She leaned closer to the microphone attached to the transmitter. She whispered, her voice like wind across snow. We hear you. Then she paused, letting the silence return. Outside, The clouds began to drift apart, and more stars shimmered through, like an audience arriving, drawn by curiosity. Messages in the moonlight. The night deepened around the observatory. Outside, frost was blooming across the grass like tiny frozen galaxies. Inside, everything was hushed, except for the gentle pulse of that cosmic signal still blinking in the sky, like a heartbeat from a faraway star. Dr. Leora sat wrapped in a wool blanket now, her eyes trained on the softly glowing screen in front of her. The signal was repeating again, just as it had before, but this time, it was changing. The pauses between beeps were slightly longer now. The rhythm was less mechanical. It felt deliberate. As if the sender had noticed her whisper. "We hear you." She felt something stir deep within her. A quiet awe, the kind children feel when they hear thunder for the first time or watch a comet cross the sky. This was the language of the stars, wordless, ancient, but full of meaning. She turned the dial on the transmitter again, gently, as if not to disturb whatever was out there. Then, in a soft voice, barely above a whisper, she spoke once more. "Are you trying to reach us?" "Nothing. Just static." Then, after several seconds, a gentle shift. The blinking stopped, then resumed in a new pattern. Still measured. Still slow. But now it pulsed 3 times, paused, and then once more. 3. Pause. 1. 3. Pause. 1. She scribbled it down in her notebook, her hands trembling with excitement. Just then, a low chime echoed through the observatory, a system alert. The telescope's old software had triggered something called spectral drift. That only happened when something was moving, fast. Dr. Leora leaned in. The signal wasn't just being sent, it was coming closer. She stepped back from the console and walked to the wide bay window. Beyond the trees, above the low hills, the stars shimmered like scattered silver. But one of them, a small, flickering blue one, seemed to move just slightly to the left. She pressed a hand against the glass, heart calm but alert. She didn't know what was coming. But she knew something, or someone, had heard her. And they were answering. The visitor above the clouds. It had been 3 days since the signal changed. Dr. Leora hadn't left the observatory, not really. She'd taken short naps on the sofa in the library room, sipped hot tea from the chipped blue mug she'd kept since her university days, and watched the sky like it was a great ocean hiding a secret ship. Outside, the weather had turned strange. The wind whispered in new tones, and clouds lingered oddly around the mountaintop, almost like they were waiting too. Each night, the signal returned, steady, pulsing, purposeful. 3. Pause. 1. She'd memorized its rhythm by heart now. The quiet beeping played on loop in her mind, like a lullaby meant for the cosmos. On the 4th night, just after midnight, something changed again. Leora had stepped outside to stretch her legs. The air was crisp, and her breath came out in little puffs of fog. As she stood near the old iron rail at the cliff's edge, she noticed the stars above her were unusually still. No twinkling. No breeze. Just a heavy silence, like the whole sky was holding its breath. Then, directly above her, a shimmer of movement. Not a shooting star. Not a plane. Not a satellite. This glowed differently. It hovered with purpose. Like a quiet lantern floating in reverse, falling up instead of down. Leora didn't move. She only stared, one hand gripping the railing as she whispered, "I see you." And as if it had heard her, as if the words mattered, that soft blue shimmer brightened just slightly. Then dimmed. Then brightened again. 3 pulses. Pause. 1. She laughed softly, the sound almost absurd in the silence. "It's you," she said aloud. "You're real." The light stayed for several minutes, gently pulsing in its sky dance. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, it faded upward, growing smaller and smaller, until it was only a speck, and then nothing. Leora returned inside, her face lit by a kind of wonder that hadn't touched her in years. She sat at her desk, pulled out her notebook, and wrote only one sentence. Not alone. The message in the silence. The observatory was quieter than usual. Not in the way most places are quiet at night, but in a deeper, more intentional way, as if the air itself was listening. Dr. Leora sat curled up in the old velvet armchair by the telescope window, a blanket around her shoulders, her journal open on her lap. The stars were out again tonight, brilliant and serene, and the signal, always the signal, was still arriving at the same time. But tonight, she noticed something she hadn't before. The pauses. Between each pulse, there were subtle irregularities, slight shifts in timing, tiny gaps that weren't quite the same each time. She blinked, leaned forward, and listened again through the monitor's soft hiss. 3 pulses, pause, 1. Then silence. And then, almost imperceptibly, a hum. It wasn't coming from the equipment. She checked every wire, every dial. The hum was not from the observatory. It was inside the signal. Like the faint resonance of a tuning fork echoing across space. She pressed the headphones against her ears. The hum was melodic, rising and falling in strange but soothing tones. Almost like a song. Not a song meant to entertain. A song meant to speak. Leora sat still, her breath shallow. She began writing down the lengths of the pauses, the notes of the hum, the time between each change. It was forming a pattern. A musical language, perhaps. One she didn't understand, yet, but felt on some instinctual level that it had meaning. Was it a greeting? A memory? A warning? No matter what it wasn't random. She called it the Song of Distance, in her notes. And deep down, she began to feel something stirring in her chest, a sensation she hadn't known in years. Hope. Because the more she listened, the more she realized something wondrous. The message wasn't just traveling to her. It was waiting for a response. The reply that took a lifetime. For the next week, Leora barely left the observatory. She slept in brief, dreamless intervals on the little cot by the window. She lived on tea, scribbled notes, and quiet astonishment. The pattern from the stars repeated every night now, and each time, it grew clearer, as if it was learning how to speak in a voice she could understand. She wasn't alone in hearing it anymore. She had reached out quietly to a few old colleagues, scientists she trusted with everything, and sent them samples. Their responses were swift and breathless. Leora, this is real. It's not a pulsar or magnetar. This is deliberate. We need to run this through a musical syntax model. Theories flooded in, alien intelligence, interstellar beacons, unknown physics. But one thing was certain. This was not natural. One night, a bold idea arrived in Leora's mind like a falling star. She had to answer it. Not with words, those would never travel far enough, fast enough. Not even with digital code. No, she had to sing back. She remembered a strange old synthesizer in the lab's storage closet, dusty and half-forgotten. She repaired it lovingly over several days, adjusting its frequencies until they matched the harmonic structure of the original signal. It wasn't perfect. But it was close. And then, just past midnight, she stood by the console, hand trembling slightly, and pressed transmit. A soft melody, the echo of the hum she'd heard, drifted into the dark, invisible waves of space. A simple reply. A soft hello. Then silence. Leora closed her eyes and imagined it traveling outward, past the moon, past Mars, past the sleeping comets at the edge of the solar system. On and on, like a whisper carried by starlight. Days passed. Nothing changed. Then, it did. Exactly 1 week later, the incoming signal shifted. For the first time since it had begun, it altered its tone, ever so slightly, to match hers. Leora's hands flew to her mouth. The signal had heard her. And it had answered back. The stars were no longer silent. And the universe had just become a little less lonely. Echoes in the silence. Leora stood in the observatory's hush, the blinking lights of the console casting soft glows across her tired face. Outside, the stars shimmered like quiet witnesses to her discovery. The signal had responded. It wasn't random. It wasn't a fluke. It was a conversation. Each night, Leora played back her tones, modest melodies born from the hums and chirps she had first detected. And each night, something in that distant darkness adjusted, mimicked, replied. It wasn't language as humans knew it. There were no words, no grammar. But there was rhythm, variation, pattern. The way it echoed her signals, sometimes immediately, sometimes after long pauses, reminded her of call-and-response songs. As if the stars were listening. She began logging each reply meticulously. Her notebook filled with lines of frequency graphs and timing intervals, with poetic scribbles in the margins like, "They paused longer tonight." Is that hesitation, or thought? Her team, now a growing circle of trusted listeners, tried running the patterns through machine learning models and musical syntax analyzers. But the signal was strange. It had an elegance that resisted logic. The computers could decode its structure, but not its meaning. Meanwhile, the world outside her observatory remained unaware. Leora had decided not to go public. Not yet. This wasn't a discovery to be shouted. It was a whisper. A fragile thread between consciousnesses that might vanish if tugged too hard. On the 7th night, something remarkable happened. After Leora sent her melody into the void, the reply came almost instantly, but this time, it changed key. The pitch had shifted upward, like the signal was evolving. Learning. Responding not just with mimicry, but intention. Leora gasped, then laughed, a soft, breathy sound lost in the static. "You're not just hearing me," she whispered aloud. "You're thinking." That night, she dreamed of deep oceans and ancient whale songs, of constellations blinking in Morse code, of two children on opposite ends of the galaxy playing a quiet game of music and patience. She woke before dawn, wrapped in her blanket, the stars still pulsing gently through the glass dome above her. The signal had spoken again. And this time, it sounded like hope. The message hidden in music. Leora sat cross-legged in the heart of the observatory, headphones gently cupping her ears. Her fingers hovered above the console, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet anticipation that comes when one stands at the edge of something vast. The latest reply had been the clearest yet. It wasn't just a sound now, it was music. Not human music, of course. There were no instruments. No familiar scales. But the signal carried resonance. Notes that rose and fell like tides. Pulses that repeated in sequences. It felt intentional. Emotional, even. She adjusted the frequencies, isolating layers of the signal, like peeling back the petals of a strange alien flower. One thread pulsed in 3s, another danced in 5s. One section slowed to a soft hum, repeating a pattern she had sent 3 days before. "They remembered," she whispered. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Somewhere, far beyond the boundaries of the solar system, or maybe in a place humanity didn't even have words for, someone or something was listening, learning, replying. She started composing again. Not with data, but with feeling. Her next transmission was a lullaby. A simple melody she remembered from her childhood, a tune her mother had sung during thunderstorms. It was soft, repeating, safe. She translated it into tones and pulses, weaving in small pauses, like the gentle breath of sleep between phrases. She sent it out. Then she waited. The reply came hours later, when the stars outside had shifted and the dome was filled with morning blue. It wasn't just a reply, it was a harmony. The signal had returned with a second layer added to her melody. A counterpoint. A new voice. They had heard her song, and sung back. Her breath caught in her throat. It was real. It was happening. And it was beautiful. She saved the file, labeled it Echo 7B, Duet. Her notes in the margin read. Not alone. Not anymore. She reached out to her team, quietly, carefully. Just a few trusted colleagues. Together, they would analyze the harmony, test its structure, compare it with known biological and mechanical patterns. But in her heart, Leora already knew. This was no reflection. This was conversation. That night, before closing her eyes, she wrote a single line in her journal. The stars are singing. And they want us to sing back. The Council of Midnight. Word of the musical signal, now affectionately called the duet, had begun to ripple quietly through trusted scientific circles. It was too early to go public, Leora insisted. Too sacred. Too delicate. The last thing this fragile communication needed was noise from the world outside. So she formed a secret circle, 5 scientists, 5 hearts that beat with wonder and restraint. They met only after dark, when the observatory's great dome was silent and the only glow came from screens and stars. Each of them brought something different. Dr. Koji Tanaka, a quantum theorist with a poet's soul. Dr. Yelena Markov, who once mapped the rhythms of whales to find patterns no computer could. Nadia Singh, a mathematician who believed every emotion had a numerical shape. Professor Ismail Adeyemi, a linguist fluent in 10 human languages and fascinated by those that were extinct. And of course, Leora, who still dreamed in stardust. Together, they called themselves the Council of Midnight. They gathered around Leora's console, playing back the duet like a sacred chant. Over and over, the tones echoed, dancing with strange, luminous precision. It's recursive, said Nadia one evening, eyes wide. The melody folds in on itself like a fractal. Koji added, and there's uncertainty. Intention layered with randomness. As if, they're giving us room to respond. It was a dialogue, but not one built on language alone. It's like jazz, Yelena whispered. They leave space for improvisation. They decided to compose a reply, together. Each of them added a layer, a harmonic, a whisper of binary, a rhythm inspired by African drums, a breath-like pause inspired by the sleep cycles of dolphins. Leora watched as the transmission took shape, an offering, not of knowledge, but of soul. And when they sent it, the stars did not respond immediately. Instead, there was silence. A silence that stretched for a day. Then 2. Then 5. Had they misunderstood? Had they offended? Had they pushed too far? But on the 7th night, the sky spoke again. Not with tones this time, but with something new, light. A soft, coordinated flicker in the outermost sensor arrays. A shimmering pattern in the neutrino detectors. Gentle pulses, almost like Morse code written in starlight. Koji wept. They changed their medium, to match ours. Yelena whispered, they're listening better than we are. For the first time in history, humanity had sent music into the void. And the void had sent back a symphony. Leora closed her eyes, hand on her heart. We are no longer searching, she thought. We are conversing. The Council of Midnight knew then, they would not speak of this to the world, not yet. Some things were not meant to be announced. Some were meant to be cherished. And so, they returned the light with light. Not a reply, but a gesture of understanding. They had stepped into a new kind of science. Not one of control, but of communion. A language without words. As days drifted into nights, and nights softened into weeks, the transmissions continued, an elegant, expanding dialogue not of words, but of symbols, rhythms, and glimmers of shared intention. The Council of Midnight no longer met only at midnight. Their sleep cycles became lunar, bound not to the sun but to the patterns emerging from the stars. The observatory felt more like a temple now, sacred, quiet, devoted. One evening, as Leora sat beside a projection of the signal's light patterns, she noticed something, a specific pulse that returned every 13 transmissions. Not a mistake, a marker. A kind of punctuation. A breath. She highlighted it. Counted its intervals. Listened to the hum it made when translated into tones. Professor Adeyemi leaned in. It's not just music or math, it's structure. Like grammar in a spoken language. Nadia nodded. And if there's grammar, there might be intentional meaning. Leora stood up, heart thrumming gently in her chest. Then maybe, this is a language after all. But not one they could speak, not with tongues or keyboards or even formulas. It was a language of sensation. Of timing, color, sound, and sequence. Yelena called it the language of sleep, because the more they immersed in it, the more it resembled a dream. It communicated not just facts, but feelings. Loneliness. Wonder. Curiosity. Joy. The council began crafting responses that weren't just data, they were emotion maps, shaped by EEG patterns recorded during deep REM sleep. They sent out gentle waves of human dreaming, translated into frequencies and harmonics and flashes of ultraviolet light. And once again, the stars responded. Not just mimicking, but building on it. Adding layers. Asking questions. Was this dreaming a form of navigation? Why did humans see memories in symbols? What was hope? Each signal returned richer, warmer. It was no longer a mystery they were trying to solve, it was a relationship they were building. One night, Leora looked out at the sky from the observatory's open-air deck. The stars felt closer now. Not just distant orbits of light, but neighbors, listeners, perhaps even, friends. She thought back to the earliest signals, the beeps, the tones, the binary pulses. So primitive now. So lonely. And yet, from that small sound, came a vast unfolding. In her sleep that night, she dreamed of a sky that blinked with meaning. She heard laughter in the auroras. She floated among constellations that whispered lullabies. And when she awoke, a soft light pulsed on the console. A message. Not from Earth. But meant for her. It shimmered with the color of moonlight. Folded with a rhythm of oceans. And shaped like something alive. The stars weren't speaking English. But they were speaking clearly. And she was finally beginning to understand. The message in the moonlight. Leora sat perfectly still as the shimmering signal pulsed across the observatory screen, soft silvers and pale blues flickering like moonlight on water. It was delicate, rhythmic, and, unmistakably intentional. The room around her had fallen into a hush. Even the blinking lights of the machine seemed to dim, as if holding their breath. Dr. Nadia leaned in. "It's changed again," she whispered. "This part, here, it's echoing our last pattern. But this is new." They all watched as the display looped once more, this time slower, as if to make itself easier to read. A spiral of soft pulses. A glimmering thread that looped into itself. And a final, gentle pause. It felt almost like a question. Yelena tilted her head. "There, waiting." Leora nodded. She didn't need a translator or a textbook to know it. Whatever intelligence was out there, it had asked something. Not just technically, but emotionally. A question wrapped in silence, sent across light years of time and space. She closed her eyes and thought about all the signals they'd sent, their hopes, their questions, their fears. And now, the stars had replied. Not with facts, but with something far more human. A moment later, the team gathered around the response console. This time, they didn't feed in data or scientific graphs. They uploaded music. A soft piano melody recorded in the quiet hours of the night. They layered in the sound of wind through trees, the soft hum of earth turning, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a sleeping child. For the first time, their response wasn't designed to impress or explain. It was meant to say, "We are here. We feel. We wonder." They transmitted the message. And waited. For hours, the signal room glowed with quiet anticipation. Coffee cups sat untouched. Journals lay open. No one spoke. And then, a flicker. A new wave of light. The same spiral pattern, but this time, the end curled into a soft loop, repeating the melody they had sent, note for note. But transformed. The notes now shimmered with starlight, danced across colors the human eye could barely comprehend. It was the music of understanding. Leora smiled. Her voice. Barely a breath. They listened. In that moment, it didn't matter who, or what, was on the other side of the stars. What mattered, was that we weren't alone. And even across the silence of space, someone had heard us. Letters between worlds. The observatory had never felt more alive, though it remained quiet, as if not to disturb the fragile thread now tying Earth to something far beyond it. The team had named the mysterious source of the signal simply, Echo. Not because it repeated, but because it seemed to respond, with warmth, with rhythm, and most mysteriously, with memory. For weeks, the communication continued. Not in words. Not in numbers. But in something older than language. Light. Sound. Pattern. Emotion. Each night, the sleep scientist and her team would compose something new. A message not of logic, but of being. One evening, they sent the sound of children laughing in a park, followed by the soft tones of lullabies sung in different languages. The signal returned a gentle melody layered over chimes that shimmered like distant ice. Another night, they transmitted rain. Just rain. Falling gently on rooftops and rivers. A symphony of quiet life. And from the stars came a reply that sounded like waves, slow, vast, echoing rhythms. Ocean meeting ocean. It was as if two civilizations, one of Earth and one of elsewhere, had started a correspondence not of facts, but of feelings. Not of declarations, but of letters between worlds. One early morning, while most of the team slept in corners of the observatory, Leora sat alone, watching the stars. She pressed record. And spoke. I don't know what you are. I don't know where you are. But I think you're kind. I think you're listening. And I want you to know, we're listening too. She paused, then added, sometimes, when things get too loud down here, I look up. And now. I wonder if you look back. The transmission was sent. And for the first time, the reply came not just as light, but as an image. On the display, a swirl of stars. Then a gentle shift. And another swirl, similar, but different, rotated in. Galaxy beside galaxy. Side by side. As if to say, yes. We see you, too. That night, no one slept. Not out of stress, or fear, but wonder. A warm, shimmering silence filled the room. Not the kind that comes from emptiness. The kind that comes from connection. The kind that says, you are not alone. The Whisper Map. The morning after the starswirl image appeared on the screens, the world seemed quieter. Or maybe it was the observatory that had fallen into a kind of reverent hush. Even the coffee machine in the corner gurgled softer, as if trying not to interrupt the fragile sense of awe hanging in the air. Leora and the team gathered around the digital projection, their eyes wide and hearts open. The image sent from Echo, if that's what it was now looping slowly in front of them. Two galaxies, almost mirroring each other, turning side by side. But something about the movement felt deliberate. Not just pretty. Purposeful. It's not just a reply, Leora whispered. It's a map. A few keystrokes later, the image was overlaid with coordinates and spectrum analysis. The galaxies weren't random, they lined up with actual celestial locations. Some nearby. Some impossibly distant. And in the space between those galaxies. Tiny pulses. Barely there. A blinking rhythm of light and darkness. Like breadcrumbs scattered across the cosmos. One of the interns, Jonah, quiet, usually hidden behind headphones, leaned in. "What if they're showing us the path?" he said. "A route. Not through space, but through understanding." Leora didn't respond right away. Because deep down, she felt it too. This wasn't just about where. It was about how. And maybe even why. That night, under the shelter of stars and a gentle summer breeze, Leora walked alone through the field behind the observatory. She looked up and imagined a trail of invisible threads connecting stars, just like the ones in the image. She whispered, "What do you want us to find?" And just as she did, her wrist comm beeped softly. A new signal had arrived. But this one was different. It didn't just hum. It pulsed in perfect time with Leora's heartbeat. Softly. Gently. As if it already knew she was listening. Back inside, they decoded it. Not a voice. Not a language. But a sound that felt ancient and new at the same time. Like wind blowing through stone canyons. Like the rustle of paper in a forgotten library. Like a whisper that had waited millennia to be heard. Leora leaned forward. "I think they've sent us a story." And so began their work to decode it. Night after night, light after light. A whisper map. A message across the ages. Not just to Earth. But to anyone who ever looked up and wondered. The library in the light. The signal pulsed through the observatory speakers like a slow, steady breath. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. But it was, there. Alive. Somehow. Leora closed her eyes and just listened. No instruments. No analysis. Just her and the sound. And in that moment of stillness, something strange happened. She saw it. Not with her eyes, but with her mind. A vivid picture, soft-edged and glowing behind her closed lids. A vast library. Floating. Suspended in darkness. But the shelves didn't hold books. They held starlight. Each beam a story. Each glimmer, a thought. They flickered gently, like candles that could never burn out. And walking through that silent space was a figure, tall and cloaked in the shimmering veil of nebulae. They didn't speak. They simply reached out and lit one of the beams, and instantly, another image formed. A planet, green and blue and spinning slowly, as if dreaming. Earth. Our Earth. And beneath it, a small light blinking in reply. Echo. Leora opened her eyes with a soft gasp. Around her, the others were silent too. Not because they were seeing what she saw, but because they were feeling something. Something too vast for words. "Are we sure this is a signal?" one of the younger researchers asked softly. Leora nodded. "I think it's more than that. It's a memory." That night, they began organizing the pulses by tone and spacing. Each burst of sound contained a different resonance, almost like keys on a cosmic piano. As they arranged them, shapes began to form. Musical patterns, symmetrical spirals, and then something unexpected. A symbol. Ancient. Universal. A spiral of light curling inward, the golden ratio, echoed in galaxies, sunflower seeds, and even the cochlea of the human ear. It was like the message was saying, "We are made of the same pattern. We, too, are searching." At midnight, Leora stood beneath the dome, watching the stars. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't looking through the telescope. She was simply being with the sky. A gentle breeze rustled the grass. The dome creaked slightly as it shifted to track a new constellation. And Leora whispered, "If this is a story, we're not just the listeners. We're part of it." The stars didn't reply. They didn't need to. Because above her, high in the heavens, the light was listening too. The language of light. The observatory was quieter than ever. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of deep listening. The kind of hush that exists when something important is about to be understood. Leora stood beside the telescope's console, her fingers gently hovering above the playback controls. The signal had grown steadier over the past few days. It was no longer just a blip of curiosity, it was a conversation, waiting to be translated. And the message, it didn't sound random anymore. With the help of her small team of sleepy scientists, Leora had begun cataloging each pulse. They weren't just signals, they were structured. Layered. Intricate. A cosmic Morse code, almost musical in nature. She played it aloud again. Soft tones. 3 long pauses. A brief flutter of rhythm. And then silence. Again and again. Until they began to see it. A pattern. A message written not in words, but in light. "We're seeing something repeated here," whispered Arjun, the night coder, his voice barely above the hum of the computers. "I mapped the frequency curve, and it mirrors the hydrogen line. And then, look here." He pointed to a spectral graph, normally just data, now glowing like sheet music. "It's matching universal constants. The golden ratio. The Fibonacci sequence. Mathematical fingerprints of intelligent thought." Leora felt goosebumps rise on her skin. "This isn't just a signal," she said softly. "It's a teaching. A greeting written in the only language shared by all things." "Light," Arjun added. "And structure." That evening, as the stars emerged one by one, Leora sat under the dome with her tea growing cold. She stared up at the telescope, no longer searching for proof, but for meaning. "If they're sending this," she murmured, "what are they hoping we'll understand?" She thought of the Voyager record, spinning through space with greetings in dozens of languages. She thought of the golden plaque, the etching of a man and woman, the sounds of Earth, the heartbeat of a planet. Maybe this signal was their version of a record. A memory of who they were. Or maybe a question. "Are you like us?" Back in the observatory, the team translated the next line of data. A spiral formed on the screen. Not a message in words, but a shape, expanding, growing, evolving. A living equation. It looked like a galaxy. It looked like DNA. It looked like Earth. Leora closed her journal that night and turned off the lights. The signal still pulsed softly on the console screen, like a heartbeat in the darkness. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It had only just begun. And out there, across the great velvet ocean of space, someone might be waiting for a reply. The reply. The observatory had always felt like a sanctuary, a quiet place. Above the world, nestled into a lonely hill where thoughts could drift into the sky without interruption. But tonight, it felt like the center of something far larger. Leora sat alone in the control room, a warm shawl around her shoulders, a cup of cardamom tea in her hands, and the glow of the console bathing her in soft, amber light. The signal was still playing. Rhythmic. Intentional. Familiar now, like a song she had once heard in a dream. But this chapter of the story wasn't about listening. It was about answering. She opened the soft leather journal where she had begun writing translations, symbols, and interpretations. Lines of light and mathematics, waveforms and spiral ratios. She studied them like ancient poetry, etched across time and space. What would she say? What could humanity send back, so far, so fragile, so full of questions? Her first idea was to send numbers, the way the universe counts. Simple, universal. Then maybe music. Tones of harmony, resonating in the language of emotion. Then perhaps, something more. She looked at the small 3D printer in the corner, the one they used to prototype telescope fittings and delicate mechanical pieces. She had an idea. Leora and Arjun spent the next few days building a new kind of beacon, one designed not just to receive, but to transmit. Using the same frequencies as the signal they'd captured, they carefully crafted a reply encoded with layers. Pulses of prime numbers. Musical intervals found in Earth's folk songs. A digital etching of Earth's continents, traced in starlight. The chemical formula for water. A heartbeat. Not a perfect message. Not even a complete one. But something human. Something true. A beginning. On the seventh night, under a sky dusted with silver stars, the team stood around the small transmission dish, surrounded by the chirping of crickets and the hush of wind through pine trees. Leora placed her hand gently on the console and whispered. "Let them know we're here. Let them know we're listening." She pressed send. A soft hum filled the air. And then, silence. There was no immediate reply. No sudden message. Just a deep quiet, a stillness in the world, as if the stars themselves were thinking. But it felt different now. Not like waiting in the dark. More like, waiting to be found. Back in her cabin, Leora wrote in her journal. "We've cast a thread into the fabric of the universe. Not to pull something toward us, but to show we're part of the same tapestry. Maybe, just maybe, we aren't alone. Maybe we never were." She blew out the candle on her desk, climbed into bed, and closed her eyes. Above her, stars shimmered silently, like eyes blinking in the far distance. And somewhere, light was still traveling. A reply on its way home. Dreams in the static. The nights that followed were filled with quiet expectation. Leora would walk alone under the stars, her scarf trailing like a comet's tail behind her, the hum of the earth blending with the soft crackle of the radio telescope sensors, still listening, always listening. But something was changing. Not in the sky. In her dreams. At first, it was subtle. A flicker of color that didn't belong. A note of music she'd never heard but somehow recognized. Then came the visions. A spiral staircase, glowing faintly with phosphorescent light, winding through a great library filled with books that hummed instead of rustled. Books without words, only vibrations. She would awaken with her hand outstretched, reaching for a page that shimmered like water, evaporating the moment her eyes opened. She began writing them down. Each morning. Symbols, patterns, feelings. One dream showed a field of mirrors facing the sky, each one reflecting a different constellation, not as they were, but as they would become. Another dream gave her a name, the Garden of Silence. Arjun noticed it too. "You've changed," he said gently one morning, handing her a warm mug of tea. Leora looked up from her notes, bleary-eyed but smiling. "I think the signal, it's still speaking. Just not out loud anymore." "You mean through dreams?" She nodded slowly. "I think they've found a quieter way to talk." Together, they studied the new patterns Leora was experiencing, soft frequencies that had begun appearing just outside the range of normal transmissions. Not noise. Not random. It was as if the telescope had begun to dream with her. Late one night, Leora traced a frequency with her fingertip on a frosted windowpane. A series of arcs and dips, curving like a lullaby written in light. She whispered, "This isn't just communication." Arjun tilted his head. "What is it then?" "A conversation," she replied. "Ongoing. Gentle. Patient. Like the stars themselves were taking their time, teaching them slowly. Softly." Back in the observatory, she placed a small handwritten note near the console. It simply read: "To those listening, thank you. We are listening, too. In the dark. In the silence, in the spaces between stars." Then she lit a candle. Let it burn beside the monitor. And closed her eyes. That night, in her dream, she walked the halls of the Library of Silence once more. But this time, she wasn't alone. A faint presence beside her. Not a voice. Not a form. Just comfort. A presence older than time. And just before waking, a new book appeared before her, its cover pulsing gently with soft golden light. She didn't open it yet. She only placed her hand on the cover. And whispered, "I'm ready." The Golden Book. The dream was warmer this time. Leora stood inside the vast Library of Silence once again, its ceiling high above, vanishing into a velvet twilight. The air shimmered faintly, like breath on glass. Before her stood the Golden Book from her last dream. Still unopened. Still glowing softly, as though lit from within. She reached for it. Her fingers brushed the cover. It was warm. Familiar. Like sunlight remembered. When she opened it, there were no pages in the traditional sense. No words, no ink. Only waves, rippling lines of light and sound that unfolded in spirals, like galaxies sketched in memory. And then, she heard it. A voice. Not in her ears, but everywhere around her, inside her, speaking in the stillness between thoughts. "You are not alone." She closed her eyes and let the meaning sink into her bones. When she woke, Leora could still feel the hum in her hands. Outside, the wind was gentle. The telescope's dish stood silent against the dawn, like a great ear pressed to the sky. Arjun was already up, sipping tea and reviewing the morning data. He looked at her and smiled knowingly. "Another dream?" She nodded. They spoke this time. His brow lifted slightly. "And?" "They said we're not alone. Not just in space," she added, "but in the way we search." For the next few nights, Leora and Arjun tuned the telescope to subtle frequencies, less like tuning a machine, more like tuning a feeling. The data they received wasn't like anything before. It wasn't images. Not signals in the traditional sense. It was shapes in data. Emotion in mathematics. Frequencies that evoked sensations. Listening to them felt like touching memories that weren't your own. One of them made Leora weep, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition. One quiet afternoon, while alone in the observatory, Leora took out a fresh notebook and began to draw. Not equations. Not star charts. She drew the library. Page after page, its arches, its halls, the books without words, the way the staircase bent toward a starless sky. And in the final drawing, she added something new. A telescope at the very center of the library, made of light and memory, looking up at the stars, not to search, but to listen. That night, the Golden Book in her dream appeared again. But this time, it was already open. And on its first page, pulsing gently like a heartbeat, were 5 symbols she had never seen before. But somehow, she understood exactly what they meant. Begin the message. Begin the message. The Golden Book shimmered gently in Leora's dream, its pages alive with symbols not made of ink, but of soft, glowing light. She traced the first 5 with her finger, feeling not just shapes, but emotion. They meant, "We hear you. We are listening." Speak. The dream dissolved like mist as she opened her eyes, but the message lingered. Leora sat up in her small bed in the observatory, heart quiet but awake. Outside the dome, the night sky was still wide and deep. She slipped on her sweater, padded out onto the cold stone floor, and looked up. The stars blinked like patient eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's begin." The next day, Leora and Arjun began constructing a reply. Not in words. Not in code. But in something older. They studied patterns, mathematical constants, golden ratios, Fibonacci spirals found in galaxies and snail shells alike. They used tones, harmonics, and pulses. The data they gathered was not only sent, they wove it into their reply. They called it the symmetry message, a kind of universal hello made not of language, but of shared wonder. Days passed. Nights grew quieter. The telescope continued listening, as though holding its breath. Then, one night, Leora woke again to the dream. But this time, she wasn't alone. She stood in the library of silence, and beside her, on the other side of the golden book, stood a figure made of starlight and curiosity. Not human. Not alien. Just, aware. They didn't speak. They listened together. The golden book turned a page on its own. And there, etched into the light, was something new. "We remember you." When Leora woke, dawn was creeping over the horizon, brushing soft orange light against the stone dome. She stepped outside, breathing in the cold air, feeling the world shift gently under her feet. She didn't need proof anymore. She didn't need confirmation. The universe had responded, not in a single beam of light or a dramatic flare of contact. But in something quieter, more beautiful. Mutual listening. Shared awe. That evening, Leora and Arjun sent the final piece of their message, a soft harmonic embedded in golden ratios, encoded in pulses like a heartbeat. It was not a declaration. It was an offering. "We wonder, too." And as the stars blinked overhead, the dish turned, the signal soared upward, and the dream returned. The whispering aurora. The mountains around the observatory were hushed in snow. Winter had crept in. Slowly, painting every tree in silver, turning breath into clouds and footsteps into quiet echoes. The sky above, now deeper and darker, had become even more perfect for listening. And then, one night, the aurora arrived. It began as a shimmer at the edge of the sky. A curtain of green, soft and slow, rippling like silk. Leora stood outside the dome, her gloved hands tucked into her coat, her eyes wide with quiet awe. But there was something strange about this aurora. It pulsed. Not randomly, but rhythmically. Inside, Arjun adjusted the instruments. "It's not just light," he said softly. "There's something encoded in it. Beneath the colors, radio waves. Barely detectable. But there." Leora didn't respond. She was too focused on what she felt. It was like a heartbeat, echoing through the sky. She pressed her fingers against the console. "Record everything," she whispered. "This isn't just a phenomenon. It's a reply." Over the next hours, they mapped the aurora like it was a living language. Green waves spoke in patterns. Faint reds flickered in intervals. Purple streaks pulsed slowly, like punctuation. And deep beneath it all, hidden in the cold silence between waves, was a frequency. Low. Gentle. Ancient. It sounded like a breath. Or a memory. That night, Leora dreamed again. But it wasn't the golden library this time. It was the sky itself. She stood beneath a universe of swirling lights, and the stars were whispering not in words, but in movement. Galaxies spun in rhythm. Nebulae danced in waves. The aurora above curled around her like an embrace. "We see you," the light said. You are not small. You are not alone. She awoke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, she and Arjun analyzed the data frame by frame. It would take weeks, months even, to understand it all. But that didn't matter. The reply had arrived. It had come not through machines, but through beauty. Through the sky. Through light. Through listening. The Star Memory Archive. As the aurora faded and the sky returned to its quiet stillness, Leora stood in the observatory's great dome and felt something had shifted, not just in the stars above, but within herself. The message wasn't just received. It had changed her. That day, the team decided to do something they had never done before. They opened the archive. A hidden part of the observatory, deep beneath the stone floor, behind a heavy iron door that hadn't been unsealed in years. It was built decades ago, during the early days of the observatory, by scientists who had hoped to preserve cosmic mysteries for generations to come. Leora carried the encoded data down with her, aurora recordings, signal patterns, telescope readings, and dreams scribbled into notebooks. She lit the old hallway lanterns as she went. They flickered warmly like little stars against the walls. When she reached the archives vault, she stood still for a moment, breathing in the dust of old discoveries. Inside were shelves upon shelves of untouched journals, star charts, spectral scans, and handwritten theories written in fading ink. There was even a wax-sealed box labeled "Unexplained Phenomena, Not Yet Understood." She smiled. "You'd fit right in," she whispered, slipping her notebook beside it. As she gently filed the data into the Star Memory Archive, she felt something unusual. The room hummed. A deep, comforting vibration. As if the very walls remembered what she had brought. Perhaps the stars didn't just send signals. Perhaps they stored them in places like this, quiet rooms where patient people kept watch. Later that night, Arjun joined her. He brought 2 mugs of warm tea and sat beside her on the stone bench. "They say light from the farthest galaxies is still arriving now," he said softly. "As if the stars are whispering across time. Maybe, this place is a library of their voices." Leora nodded. "And maybe," she added, "we're not just scientists." He tilted his head. "What are we, then?" She smiled gently. "We're keepers of memories the universe is still trying to tell." The aurora had left. The stars had gone quiet again. But the observatory now glowed with a stillness filled with meaning. And down in the archive, a new shelf had been added. The signal from the stars. Filed under, First Contact, Ongoing. The Dreaming Telescope. After days spent among star charts and encoded signals, Leora returned to the telescope dome with a feeling she couldn't quite explain, like someone waking from a dream only to find the dream was still happening, just quietly, beneath the surface of the waking world. She slid her hand along the side of the observatory's grand telescope, the one that had first caught the anomaly weeks ago. The metal felt cool, calm, familiar. But tonight, it felt something more. It felt alive. She remembered a story her grandfather once told her. That sometimes, when a telescope had watched the stars long enough, it began to dream of them. He called them dreaming telescopes, instruments so ancient and loved that they seemed to yearn for the skies they observed. Not just machines, but listeners. Leora chuckled softly at the thought, but tonight, she believed it. She climbed the steps to the eyepiece and looked through. At first, just stars. Tiny, gentle, flickering dots across a canvas of black velvet. But as her eyes adjusted, and her thoughts quieted, something began to unfold. A pattern in the flickers. Like ripples in light. Like music being played in wavelengths rather than notes. She quickly adjusted the lens, aligning it with the sector where the signal had once pulsed. The same area of sky now glowed subtly, as if the stars there were holding their breath. Suddenly, click. The telescope moved. Not by her hand. The gears turned slowly. The lens tilted. The dome's opening rotated. It was guiding itself. To a new patch of sky. To something waiting there. Leora stepped back, her breath still. And then she heard it. A single tone. Low and soft, more feeling than sound. The telescope was listening again. Not just capturing data, but receiving. Almost like it had learned. She activated the recording instruments. The computer showed a slow pulse, much fainter than the first signal, but unmistakably patterned. Not random. Not noise. A second message. Arjun, awakened by the motion of the dome, joined her. "It's back," he whispered. "No," Leora said softly. "It never left. I think, it was just waiting for us to understand the first part." They watched the telescope continue its slow, almost thoughtful movement, like a finger tracing constellations across a sleeping sky. And Leora knew then. They weren't observing the universe anymore. The universe was observing them back. The second signal. The room filled with a hush. Not silence, no, it was deeper than that. A kind of stillness that made Leora feel like she was floating. As if time had paused to watch with her. On the screen, the pattern unfolded, line by line. The second signal was more delicate than the first. Like an echo whispered through the folds of space. But it was there. And this time. It was different. Where the first signal had been structured, almost mathematical, this one was melodic. Not in a musical sense, but in rhythm, in rise and fall. Like a breath. Like the call of something alive. "I think it's a reply," Arjun murmured. Leora nodded, fingers flying across the keyboard. Or maybe, the rest of the sentence. The computers struggled to keep up. This signal wasn't just binary code. It was layered, woven like threads through fabric. Each layer pulsed at its own frequency. One was steady, like a heartbeat. Another danced like light over water. A third was nearly imperceptible, like memory buried in the hum of static. They realized. It wasn't one voice. It was many. Arjun stared at the data. This could be a whole civilization. Leora looked up. Or more than one. She imagined it then. Beings not like us. Not carbon-based. Not bound to planets or breath. But ancient. Spread across light years. Communicating through pulses of starlight and gravity waves. Not shouting into the void. But whispering. Waiting for someone to whisper back. Outside, the night had deepened. Clouds passed quietly over the dome. The wind curled around the observatory like a lullaby. Inside, the telescope stood still once more, its movements complete. It had shown them what they needed to see. Leora placed a hand on the base. "Thank you," she whispered. She meant it. Not as a scientist. As a friend. They sat side by side in silence. On the screen, the signal continued to pulse, soft and steady. Like stars breathing in the dark. And somewhere far across the galaxy. Someone might be listening too. The language of light. In the hours that followed, Leora barely moved. The observatory was quiet, bathed in a warm glow from the console lights and the stars outside. The second signal kept streaming in, soft and patient, as if it had all the time in the universe. And maybe it did. Arjun sipped lukewarm tea, eyes fixed on the layered waveform dancing across the screen. "I think, it's not a message we decode," he said gently. Leora tilted her head. "Then what is it?" He smiled faintly. "Something we feel." The pulses weren't words. Not in the way humans knew language. They were intervals, patterns, glowing points in space. It was like watching a constellation form, not just with stars, but with meaning. Each cluster seemed to hold an intention. A kind of emotional geometry. Joy curved in slow spirals. Curiosity echoed in rising crescents. Grief moved like a falling wave. Leora's heart softened as she watched. "I think they're telling us about themselves," she said, voice barely above a whisper. She imagined beings of light, drifting through star clouds, etching their thoughts into gravity and time. Not demanding to be understood. Just offering a piece of who they were. The software tried its best to translate. But where it failed, Leora's imagination reached further. One sequence reminded her of wind through tall grass. Another felt like the hush after a snowfall. These weren't facts. They were feelings. And suddenly, the vastness of space didn't feel so lonely anymore. The observatory seemed smaller now. Not in a limiting way, but in a cozy, sacred way. Like it had become a little cabin in the middle of a living, breathing forest of stars. Somewhere out there, something had spoken. And she had heard it. Not with her ears, but with her wonder. She rested her head on her folded arms, eyes growing heavier with each soft flicker of the screen. Arjun dimmed the lights a little more. The last log saved. The signal still pulsing. The story still unfolding, slowly, gently. And as Leora drifted into sleep, one thought hummed gently in her mind. Light is a language. And maybe, she had finally learned to listen. The memory hidden in starlight. The morning came quietly to the observatory, soft sunlight warming the floor, and a thin mist clinging to the windows like a dream that hadn't yet let go. Leora sat on the observatory floor, barefoot and wrapped in a sweater, sipping from a chipped mug that smelled faintly of cinnamon. The signal still pulsed on the monitor, steady as breath. She hadn't slept long, but what little rest she'd had was deep, filled with lights, spirals, and voices that didn't use words. Across the room, Arjun knelt beside a notebook, one of Leora's, full of sketches and scribbled equations. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this signal, it feels less like communication and more like memory." Leora looked up. "Memory?" "Yes," he nodded. "Like it's remembering something. Like a dream the universe had a long time ago and just now decided to share." The next sequence confirmed his hunch. A new stream of pulses began to echo across the console, slower than before, spaced like footsteps through ancient corridors. Each wave of data contained a luminous curve of energy, repeating every few minutes. But what made Leora's breath catch was that the curve wasn't random. It was identical to the decay pattern of a star, one that had died millions of years ago. She recognized it instantly. It was a supernova recorded long before she was born. And yet, here it was, echoing back in a message, sent by something, or someone, who had watched it happen. "Whoever sent this," Leora whispered, "they saw it. They remember it." The star that had gone silent in human records was still glowing in their story. It hadn't vanished. It had been preserved, folded into light, encoded into space, and sent across the void like a lullaby made of gravity and gold. "They don't just want to talk to us," Arjun said quietly. "They want us to remember what they've seen." It was a gift of cosmic memory, moments from the past, offered to beings who were still learning how to look. Later that day, Leora stood beneath the wide dome of the observatory. Outside, a group of schoolchildren arrived, their small hands pressed to the glass, wide-eyed and curious. She smiled. Because now, she understood. The signal wasn't a warning, or a puzzle to solve. It was a story. One that began long before humans walked the earth. One that asked for nothing but presence, and wonder. And as night returned and the stars lit the sky once more, the signal pulsed again. Slow. Steady. Certain. A memory shared. A message received. And a story, still unfolding. The Star Garden. That night, as the observatory settled into its soft rhythm of blinking lights and humming instruments, Leora opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside were tiny slips of paper, each folded around a dried flower. Years ago, when she'd first arrived here as a young student, she'd started a habit. Whenever she felt overwhelmed or lost, she would pick a flower from the nearby fields, write one line of hope or discovery, and tuck it away like a seed waiting to bloom again. Now, decades later, those little petals rustled like ancient pages, and her words, once scribbled in haste, felt like whispers from her past self. She unfolded one at random. It read, "Someday, we'll find something that proves the universe was listening all along." Leora smiled. Because now, she had. The signal, still steady in its cadence, had grown softer that evening, less like a broadcast and more like a breath. She watched its gentle rise and fall on the screen and imagined it not as a machine or intelligence far away, but as a being, resting. Perhaps it was dreaming. And perhaps, it had planted this moment, her moment, like a seed. She walked out onto the observatory deck, where the sky stretched wide and velvety overhead. The children from earlier had left, but they'd made something before they went, a ring of paper stars, taped carefully to the railings. They fluttered in the wind like curious satellites, each one marked with a child's drawing, of planets, comets, suns with smiling faces. Even if they didn't understand the science, they felt the wonder. That, she thought, was more than enough. Later that night, Leora sat cross-legged on the floor beside Arjun. Between them, scattered on the tiles, were papers filled with sketches, waveforms, ideas. "We could call it a star garden," Arjun said suddenly. "What?" "This project," he gestured at the data they'd collected. "The signal, the memory, everything. It's like planting stories from the stars, and waiting to see what blooms in us." Leora looked at him, her eyes soft. "Yes," she said. "A star garden. That's exactly what it is." Above them, the telescope shifted ever so slightly, tracking a new part of the sky. The stars blinked. And somewhere far beyond even the deepest nebulae, the signal pulsed once more. A heartbeat. A beginning. A message. "Keep looking. We're not so far apart." The whispering comet. Days passed like soft waves brushing the shore, and the observatory settled into a peaceful kind of anticipation. The signal from the stars continued to arrive, steadily, gently, its rhythm like the breath of something vast and sleeping. But then, something changed. It was Arjun who noticed it first. While reviewing the latest data under the golden lamplight of the library, he paused. "Leora," he said slowly, "it's not just a signal anymore. It's modulating." Leora looked up from her notes, blinking. "Modulating?" He turned the screen to her. A new pattern had emerged. The signal, once steady and rhythmic, now had a wavering lilt to it, like the shimmering tail of a comet dancing across the sky. "It's almost musical," Arjun whispered. Leora leaned in, heart quickening. She remembered a theory, one from a forgotten paper she'd read long ago, that highly advanced messages might not be spoken, or written, or even coded, but sung. "Like a lullaby," she said. "A lullaby from space?" Arjun asked, his voice barely a breath. Leora nodded. "Or maybe, a memory." The observatory team gathered that night, wrapped in blankets and soft wonder. They listened through headphones, not to sound, but to the shape of the signal translated into tones. It was haunting and delicate. Like wind chimes in the dark. Like the call of a comet whispering to those who dared to listen. No one spoke. There was only awe. Later, Leora stood on the balcony, gazing up at the stars above. She imagined the signal traveling across unimaginable distances, brushing past galaxies, dancing around black holes, gliding through dust and silence, to find its way to their little observatory on Earth. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why us?" And in that moment, as if in reply, a real comet streaked across the sky, silver and slow, its tail trailing dreams behind it. The team gasped. It wasn't just coincidence. It was poetry. Back inside, Arjun laughed softly. "You know what this reminds me of?" "What?" "That old story, about sailors who used to navigate by the stars. They called it celestial guidance." Leora smiled. "And now, maybe, we're the ones being guided." She picked up a small notebook and wrote at the top of a fresh page. The comet whispered back. And in the stillness of that night, the stars above shimmered gently. As if they were listening too. The map and the silence. The days following the comet's visit were marked by a calm hush at the observatory. Leora noticed it first, not just in the signal, but in the world around her. The birds seemed quieter. The wind less restless. Even the machines hummed more gently. As if the earth itself was pausing, listening. And then, the signal changed again. This time, it stopped completely. No flickers. No pulses. Just silence. Leora and Arjun sat in front of the telescope array, the screens completely blank except for a timestamp. The signal had ended at 3:33 a.m., precisely. No warning. No fade. Just, gone. Arjun folded his hands quietly. Maybe it was always meant to be temporary. A window we were lucky enough to catch. Leora shook her head, her eyes narrowed with quiet wonder. "No. I think it's more like a trail of breadcrumbs. A signal, leading to something else." She returned to the wall of notebooks. Page after page of signal recordings, waveforms, harmonics, time stamps. And then, on a whim, she layered the recordings on translucent paper. She arranged them on the floor, shifting them slowly under the lamp's warm glow. Something began to form. A pattern. A shape. Not random. Not noise. It was a star chart. A map. Arjun leaned over her shoulder, stunned. "That's the Virgo supercluster," he murmured. "And here," Leora said, pointing gently to the heart of the pattern, "is a coordinate. A place. A very specific one. In the direction of a star system no one had visited. One known only by a catalog number." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the night was perfectly clear. The moon a quiet witness overhead. And just beyond it, in that same part of the sky, lay the point marked on the signal's hidden map. Leora whispered, "I think we were never meant to decode it. We were meant to follow it." Later that night, she recorded her thoughts into the observatory journal. They didn't want us to understand. They wanted us to wonder. Wonder is the first step to reaching them. The observatory lights dimmed one by one. Outside, above the mountains, a soft shimmer appeared, barely visible to the naked eye. A tiny, flickering star pulsed gently. Just once. As if to say, "Yes. You're on the right path." Preparing the first step. The next morning arrived not with fanfare, but with a stillness that felt full of possibility. The observatory bathed in golden light as Leora sat quietly with a cup of tea, her eyes drifting from the star map to the window, where the mountain peaks glowed like watchful giants. She had a feeling today would be different. Arjun arrived with a bundle of printouts under his arm. "You're not going to believe this," he said softly. He spread the documents across the desk. They were astronomical surveys, data from probes, telescopes, and observatories across the globe. Quiet, obscure coordinates. Faint stars. Places no one had really focused on. And yet, in the exact spot the signal map had pointed them to, there had been a faint anomaly. Not noise. Not a comet. Not a flare. A blink. A single flicker of light, symmetrical and perfectly timed. It had been detected by one telescope in Chile, ignored as a glitch. But it matched the signal's pulse sequence. Leora's breath caught in her throat. They sent a signal and left a marker? Arjun nodded. Like a cosmic breadcrumb. It's as if they're waiting. They spent the day coordinating with global telescopes. The International Deep Space Network. A university in Iceland. A small private station in New Zealand. Everyone was skeptical at first, until Leora sent the recordings. One by one, they listened. And one by one, they replied with quiet awe. A slow wave of realization began spreading in the scientific community, not loud or dramatic, but careful, like candlelight passed hand to hand in the dark. Something, or someone, had left a trail. By nightfall, Leora had submitted a formal proposal to redirect an orbital telescope toward the coordinates. She closed her laptop, her hands slightly trembling. I think we're about to see something no one's ever seen, she whispered. That evening, as she sat beneath the stars, the wind stirred gently around her. The moon rose, casting its silver sheen across the trees and dome of the observatory. And somewhere, in the deep silence between stars, a flicker answered back. Not from Earth. Not from the moon. But from the place in the signal's map. Soft. Faint. But deliberate. The stars were watching. The eyes that watched back. For most of human history, telescopes have only watched, peering out, curious and quiet, never expecting the universe to gaze back. But that changed tonight. The orbital telescope, Crescent Array 1, rotated into position. It took 10 hours to align with the coordinates. 10 hours of holding breath. Of pacing floors and sipping tea that went cold in trembling hands. Of scientists speaking in hushed tones like they were in a sacred hall. Leora hadn't slept. She sat in the observatory's central dome, Arjun beside her, both staring at the uplink feed. All systems were green. Calibration, perfect. Signal, steady. Then, the image arrived. At first, there was only blackness. Stars, faint and familiar. Empty silence. Then, a pattern. Not a planet. Not a star. But something, shaped. Like a glimmering oval, made of light and dust, hovering just beyond the visible spectrum. It shimmered like rippling water, like the edge of a soap bubble catching starlight. No natural formation had ever looked like this. The telescope zoomed closer, enhancing the spectrum. Hidden frequencies emerged, pale blues, lavender hues, ghostly gold. Then, the pulse came again. Not from the signal tower. But from there. The image blurred slightly, just for a moment, and reformed. And in that flicker, it almost looked like an eye. A single eye of light, ancient and dreaming. Watching Earth. Leora felt tears spring to her eyes, not from fear, but from the vastness. The feeling of being seen. Not as a threat, not as an experiment. But as something, curious. As something worth noticing. Do you think it's alive? Arjun whispered. Leora shook her head. I don't know. But I think, it remembers. They submitted the data to the International Astronomical Union under the name Observation 92K, the watching signal. Overnight, the astronomy world lit up, quietly, reverently. No one was ready to declare it alien. But no one could explain it either. The press didn't know yet. The public hadn't heard. But in silent corners of the Earth, among late-night researchers and sleepy-eyed grad students, word was spreading. Something is out there. And it knows we're here. That night, as Leora stepped outside into the cool mountain air, the stars above her felt warmer somehow. Closer. Not just pinpricks of light, but lanterns in windows. And beyond one of those windows, someone had just turned on a light. Echoes beneath the ice. The world above was still hushed, government silent, scientists whispering, but beneath the southernmost ice of Earth, another echo stirred. Thousands of miles from Leora's observatory, beneath the ancient glaciers of Antarctica, a quiet station known as Aurora Deep was watching something entirely different. Dr. Halima Reyes adjusted her headphones, eyes narrowed. The neutrino detectors had been picking up unusual data for weeks, but tonight, the signals shifted. They had rhythm now. Not random. Not geological. Intentional. Far below the ice, where no light had touched for millions of years, a massive subterranean reservoir echoed back the cosmos, recording something long before humanity had invented radios or telescopes. Halima leaned closer. The computer display translated the patterns into sound. What she heard wasn't language. It was music. A haunting, slow, melodic rise and fall, like the song of a distant whale, only impossibly old and low, as if the earth itself had been humming it for eons. It matches the pulse, she whispered to herself, fingers trembling. The same cadence as the signal Leora had tracked. Half a world away, something was calling. And beneath the ice, the earth was quietly answering. That night, Halima sent a single encrypted message to the North Star Observatory. Antarctica sings. Your signal has an echo. And it's coming from below. Leora woke to the message just before dawn. Her breath caught. The stars weren't just looking back. They had been here before. And something in the deep, glacial memory of Earth, remembered. The map in the sky. Leora sat wrapped in a heavy shawl as the wind whispered across the cliffs outside the observatory. The air was sharp, clean, and cold, so clear that the stars seemed almost close enough to touch. But her thoughts were thousands of miles away, beneath the Antarctic ice. She reread Halima's message over and over. Antarctica sings. Your signal has an echo. And it's coming from below. What could it mean? Could the signal from the stars be mirrored deep within Earth itself? Was this a dialogue? Or a memory? She turned slowly toward the main telescope, its great eye pointed skyward, as if it too were waiting for an answer. Then it came. Not another pulse, not this time. It was a pattern. The faint lights from a distant galaxy flickered in a way that had nothing to do with stellar motion or gravitational lensing. They blinked with gentle timing, like lanterns held in space. Leora's fingers moved quickly across the console. She began overlaying the flickers on a star map, drawing lines, connecting pulses. What emerged made her chest tighten. A constellation she had never seen before. Not one from any human mythology. But it looked like something, drawn with purpose. A spiral. A direction. A map. Back beneath the Antarctic ice, Halima's equipment pinged again. The ice core resonance now matched Leora's pattern in the sky. A spiral was forming in both places, one above, one below. The Earth and the stars were mirroring each other. Across continents, Leora and Halima stared at their data, two scientists in silence, connected by wonder. They didn't yet know where the map led. But it was clear now. They were being invited somewhere. By something very old, and very patient. The answer in the silence. The sea was calm that night, as Leora stood on the deck of the research vessel Equinox, its silhouette drifting through the Southern Ocean, closer to Antarctica's icy breath. She had followed the signal. Followed the map. And now, she was here, on the edge of something ancient. Down below the ice shelf, Halima waited in the subglacial station, her voice soft over the comms. We've synchronized everything. The resonance and the star pattern, they're lining up perfectly. If we're right, we should see it, now. Leora adjusted the telescope, pointing it precisely where the spiral had indicated. And there, hovering just beyond the visible stars, was something else. Not a planet. Not a comet. Not even a structure in the traditional sense. It was a pause in space. A stillness so deliberate, it felt like it had been carved out of time. As Leora stared, the silence deepened, not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet. It wasn't just a message. It was a memory. The universe was remembering something. Or perhaps, someone. Leora whispered into the mic, her voice barely a thought. It's not a signal we're answering, Halima. It's a door we've just opened. Back on land, months later, Leora published their findings, but quietly. No headlines. No fanfare. Just a gentle paper with 2 names at the top and 1 phrase at the bottom. Not alone. Not loud. Just listening. And every so often, she'd return to the observatory. She wouldn't always point the telescope. Sometimes, she'd just sit by the window and look up. Because now, she knew. The stars weren't just burning. They were waiting. And somewhere, far beyond what science could yet explain, something was still listening back. The end. Sleep well, dear dreamer. Milky Way. May your night be quiet, and full of stars.